Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 2. Over a month had passed before the ducal coach returned, bearing several ministers of law, with the marriage proxy riding alongside it. Mina, well warned of their approach, watched with wide eyes from behind the drapes as Will was once more polished to appear in her place.
"My, what a fine seat your proxy has!" she sighed, blushing lightly. "It's too bad that he is not the heir. I should not mind being a duchess if he were the duke."
Will scowled at her, asking with ill humour and with sharpness born of pure, dreadful anxiety, "And what of Timothy? Or are your affections so fleeting?" Mina laughed, a floating and lovely sound, and left the window to look him over.
"That is my favourite day dress. Don't get anything on it."
"No, I suppose it doesn't matter now." Will didn't dignify that with a response. His father's influence was such that he felt ridiculous in her beautiful dresses, though the maids all assured him that he wore them with the same grace and charm as his sister. Still, he couldn't imagine continuing this farce for long. According to his father, he wouldn't have to. The coach rolled to a stop, and Mina ordered the servants to start loading her trunks. Her new wardrobe was already commissioned, no few pieces presently in her keeping. She was eager to clear out her old gowns to make room, and continue the illusion that Will was nothing more than the lovely young lady he seemed. A part of him wanted to be, that part of him his father had all but gutted him of. He hoped that they would be content with him, that he might be able to make a life that was, if not happy, at least a little less miserable than his life here at home. He had amused himself with daydreams that had grown with time, silly imaginings that left him smiling with possibilities despite the fury that would no doubt follow his deceit. He just wanted to be part of a proper family. He just wanted to be useful and important to someone, to have some small trace of the love that his sisters had enjoyed growing up, and from their respective spouses. He would gladly bear the Lecter family's ire if only they would choose to be kind to him in time. Blake came for him. The moment Will stepped out from Mina's room, he could smell the scent of an unfamiliar alpha mingling with his father's own, overridden by the sharp taint of fear. Dismayed and suddenly frightened, Will hurried after Blake to the receiving room, where 2 lawyers, the proxy, and his father were already waiting. His father's wide blue eyes betrayed his stark concern, and Will immediately knew that what they had planned was impossible. The moment the alpha proxy turned to face him, startled recognition crossed his handsome features, and he frowned, knowing without a doubt what they had done. "Willia, this is Anthony Dimmond, Viscount du Maurier, Hannibal Lecter's cousin and proxy," the Earl said, as if keeping to manners might somehow prevent the inevitable realization that he was trying to force an omega off on them. "My Lord du Maurier, this is my daughter, Willia Graham." "Lady Graham," Anthony said, approaching Will's trembling form with the lithe grace of a cat, amusement and wonder dancing in his blue eyes as he swept Will's hand up for a kiss. Will managed a small curtsy, averting his gaze, hyper-aware of the way the man's nostrils flared, and uncomfortably certain that his own scent was changing in the presence of the virile alpha youth. "Gentlemen," Anthony said, addressing the room, "Lady Graham needs some air. I will have her servant. I will take her for a turn about the garden," Anthony said, cutting the Earl off. He subsided with indignant, frightened fury, but did not protest. Anthony looped Will's arm over his elbow, graced him with a cat-like smile, and escorted him straight from the house to the garden without saying another word. Will clutched his arm unconsciously, barely aware of the warm material beneath his spread fingers, but uncomfortably aware that an alpha male had a hold of him. His pulse raced like mad from it, and from the fear that he was caught. He was sure that he was being led out here for some terrible purpose or harsh scolding that would only precede the one his father would give him. Instead, Anthony pulled him to a bench within sight of the receiving-room windows and settled him there, asking, "Do you mind if I smoke?" Not trusting his voice, Will shook his head and directed his gaze at his lap, fidgeting. "Look here at me, please," Anthony asked, and Will tipped his head up to find the man looking at him intently as he rolled a cigarette, his blue eyes critical. "You are lovely, Lady Graham. I suppose you hear that quite a lot." Will shook his head again, managing, I am not allowed visitors or visiting. Anthony chuckled and licked the paper on his cigarette, sealing it tight before lighting it and taking a deep pull. He blew smoke out, picked a small bit of tobacco from his tongue, and asked, "What game is your father playing at, I had wondered why he was so beside himself when I showed up. What say you, Lady Graham?" Will shivered but did not answer. Every instinct he possessed urged him to throw himself at this man's feet and beg for mercy, to somehow save himself whatever retribution was to come. But the memory of his father's beatings were stronger than any instinctive urge, and he sat still, caught like a deer at dawn, eyes wide and mouth parted. Anthony laughed softly, shaking his head. Did he think he could fool another alpha with this? He gestured at Will's person with his free hand. Wouldn't make a difference if he hadn't deliberately put to Mr. Stamets that you were a beta female, but the crux of the issue is that he has. So I suppose the question is, why has your father presented you as your sister? Will began to tremble, uncertain just how much he knew of that contract and how Mr. Stamets had represented him to the Lecter family. I had wondered when they said your name was Willia. I could have sworn the charming minx I'd seen was named Wilhelmina, and answered to Mina, not Willia. Are you twins? You look so much like her, it's uncanny. Will swallowed hard and nodded. An Omegan twin, Anthony mused, busying himself with his cigarette as he thought. Is there some reason your sister doesn't want to marry my cousin? Mind you, I can think of 1,000 reasons why any sane woman wouldn't, considering. But Mina surely hasn't that much knowledge of him, young as she is. Lord Rathmore just settled with our father for her hand, Will quietly admitted. There was no way to break him without hard feelings. Anthony blew out a cloud of smoke, amused and smiling. And then comes along Stamets with a decades-old contract, and your father has a brilliant idea to settle both. Will dropped his gaze again. He seemed certain it would sort things. Yes, I imagine your father has a very good idea of the man my cousin is, Anthony said, moving to sit next to Will. He searched Will with jaded blue eyes, looking for some crack in his composure, for something he could use. Your father dislikes you immensely. Will looked off in the other direction, baring the long column of his throat as he did so, a combination of movements created to beg clemency and to be left alone, performed by instinct rather than design. Yes, he whispered. Immensely. Anthony was silent for a long moment, contemplating. I have half a mind to go back to grandfather and have him settle this. Will made a low, distressed noise at what that statement conjured. Images of Mina, dragged unwilling to wed her ducal heir, heartbroken and bereft. Lord Rathmore's family siding against his father, incensed at the indignity they'd been dealt. His own father blaming him for giving it all away and ruining his plans. Will shuddered to think of what would happen then. Then again, this could be fairly interesting, Anthony said, more to himself than to Will. Strictly speaking, your father did not breach the contract. You are capable of bearing an heir, so there should be no complaint on that count. Though I do feel somewhat a cad handing you to Hannibal, now that I think of it. Please! Will managed, turning to him to plead, more terrified of his father than he was of a stranger he'd never met. He went so far as to grasp Anthony's hand, his blue eyes wide and beseeching. Please! Pretend all is well. Then I will be your cousin's problem to deal with, and I will swear you knew nothing. That made him laugh, thoroughly amused, and he squeezed Will's small hand in his. You fetching little thing. But they will never believe I did not know. Your father has done you no favours, darling. The moment you set eyes on me, your scent changed, and I am but half the alpha my cousin and grandfather are. You are quite obviously and delightfully an omega, and there will be no hiding that fact. Will all but wilted, sickly thinking of his life to come. However, I can claim that I assumed you were, in fact, the one on offer. And Mr. Stamets can confirm that, bless his beta heart. With all of the legal aspects put into place, the family will be loath to take action against your father, leaving your sister quite in the clear for Lord Rathmore. Will's relief emerged as a breathless laugh, and he tipped his head back, drawing a breath that was eloquent of delighted release of tension. Lord du Maurier, he said when he could speak at last, his fingers clutching on the large, strong ones in his grip. I owe you my life, sir. Anthony's blue eyes held an unholy gleam that Will was utterly unaware of. Smiling, he said, "I will hold you to that, Lady Graham. Shall we have ourselves a wedding?" Will, insulated with his own naive experience, nodded vigorously, pleased and relieved that he would not have to face his father's wrath. He had no idea that there could be ever so much worse than his father's vitriolic hatred awaiting him. The ceremony, such as it was quick and to the point. The Earl printed Will's name on the document as Willia M. Graham, and Will signed his name as he always did. There would be no escape on a technicality on the documents themselves that declared William Graham the property and legal spouse of Hannibal Lecter via proxy. The trunks were loaded by the time it was all legally accomplished. The two lawyers took a hired hack back to the capital to file the paperwork, and Will was bundled into the ducal coach to be taken before the Duke himself, without any fanfare or word of goodbye from his family. "Have you wrapped your mind around it all?" Anthony inquired, choosing to ride inside the coach with Will, instead of alongside it. "Yes, my lord," Will answered, prompting the man to laugh with delight. "Ha! No. You are Marchioness now, and my better Will. May I call you Will? I got the impression that female clothing is not to your taste, and that you've a preference for male address." Will blushed lightly, fingering the fine dress he'd been given away in. Mina's favourite, no more. "It isn't precisely not to my liking. It is only that it has been soundly disallowed in my father's house." "Disallowed?" "Yes. Father says a young man must not make a spectacle of himself with colour and cut. He says a young man must at all times be serious and attentive to his work and not distracted by frivolous things." Anthony sat silent for a moment before venturing. "You are an Omega, Will. Do you have nothing of colour in your keeping besides your sister's wardrobe?" "No, sir, I have not," Will answered, blushing. "I have no desire for such things." "Is that yourself speaking, or is that your father?" Will fidgeted, wishing that Anthony would not look at him so closely. "I can assure you that the Duke will overhaul any deficiencies you arrive with once he accepts you," Anthony said, making the soft hue of Will's blush a vivid, embarrassed red. "Your father forced you into a rather unconventional lifestyle. I do hope that you gleaned enough skills to make the heir a good match." "They are more than welcome to send me home," Will said, appalled at his own temerity, but lacking any other recourse. He had no Alpha to guide him, and no previous experience to draw from, so he was left to fend for himself. Anthony laughed at that. "Alas, no! Your father was most insistent on that point. You, my dear, are an unbreakable commitment. Should you fail to meet the expectations, you are remanded to the Duke's custody for disposal as he sees fit." Will let out a trembling breath, but evinced no surprise. Anthony's brows rose at that reaction. "He must truly dislike you indeed to offer such a thing. Perhaps he thinks he has ruined you, forcing you into a male role. I know very few Omegas who live as only true men do. So very few, in fact, that I cannot call any name to mind. Prospects are better for females when it comes to marrying up, I suppose." "I was content," Will said, swallowing hard. His allegiance to his father was so deeply rooted and powerful that he could not speak a word against him. Instead, he merely wet his lower lip with the tip of his tongue, and looked out at the unfamiliar scenery passing by. "I lived as I was told to live by my Alpha. I was content to obey him." Anthony snorted, clearly not impressed with this reasoning. "Hannibal is going to chew you up and spit you out." Will started, shocked, a sudden bolt of fear rocketing him. He turned his wild eyes to Anthony, who merely smiled at him, and clenched his fingers into the soft folds of Mina's dress. "Or perhaps, if you look at him like that," Anthony remarked, chucking him under the chin, "he may be content to swallow you whole." "Ah, don't be so frightened. There's nothing to be done for it now. I did, however, have the foresight to ask that insufferable Blake to pack your usual clothing. Considering the colours his face turned, he did as he was bidden." Why would I need such?" Will asked, his voice thready with panic. "Call it a hunch," Anthony said, winking at him, and would say no more on the subject. Hannibal drew in a deep breath of tangy country air, and sighed, eyes sweeping closed as a knot of anxiety unravelled inside of him. After nearly a decade he was home again on the soil of his homeland, riding down familiar roads on his very own horse while a ducal coach rode along somewhere behind him bearing his trunks and his disgruntled valet. He caught sight of Hertford House and tapped his stallion's rump with his crop, clicking his tongue to urge him into a trot. He felt a keen desire to see his grandfather again, the worry for him that Hannibal had suppressed all this time finally rising to the top. He was no young man any more, the Duke, and no doubt it was far past time for Hannibal to settle and take over the running of the estate so that grandfather could enjoy his retirement. Which brought to mind what manner of wife his grandfather had picked from those on offer in the Earl's household. The Reddig daughters were all beautiful, he'd been told, enchantresses with good health and genteel pursuits, and no head for harshness, which, Hannibal knew too well, meant they were somewhat stupid and easily entertained, but at least physical beauty would make the task of getting an heir less onerous. A missive had been waiting for him at the port, saying that Anthony was to marry her by proxy, and she would be registered officially as his spouse, and the various entitlements that went along with that would be put into place by the time he arrived home. Hannibal was surprised at their rush, but could only assume some hurry had been in order. Then again, perhaps his grandfather merely wished her to be waiting for him on his return, ready to provide the longed-for children that would keep the Lectors a solid presence among the nobility. Or perhaps she is simply unpleasant, he murmured, frowning softly as he rounded the bend and hit the lane for Hertford House. He found himself searching the place as he rode up, refreshing his memory with its sparkling windows and intricate embellishments. He saw staff milling out front as a coach drew up at the house just ahead of him. Someone spotted him, which sent them all into a flurry of activity. He slowed the stallion, despite his anticipation, giving them time to prepare for his arrival. Will was awoken from his broken, uncomfortable slumber by the sudden shift of the coach as they pulled into the drive of the sprawling estate belonging to the Duke of Westvale, commonly known as Hertford House, according to Anthony. He fought not to tremble at the thought that this could be his future home. It was far more stately and vast than his father's estate. He began to imagine the number of rooms from the number of windows and the amount of staff such a place would require just to keep it livable. That calmed him somewhat, enough to make his breathing even out and his heart slow just a touch. Anthony watched him carefully, amused by his reactions. "You're remarkably poised for being so far from your father, Will," he said, careful not to touch him or startle him in any way, cautious of him as only an alpha could be. "Father was insistent that I learn to do without him," Will quietly said. "He said it was unseemly that any person be unable to function without someone else to decide for them. He wanted me to be able to deal well on my own, if I managed to outlive him." "'Tisn't natural for anyone to want to be on their own," Anthony said, disapproval tinging the words. "You will be much more comfortable here, I hope. We'll see what happens when the Marquess arrives. Until then, I am sure you'll find the Duke's presence far more stabilizing than that of your father. The Lectors are one of the oldest alpha lines in the realm, after all." "I am aware of their history, sir." "Ah, here we are," Anthony breathed, a sigh of relief leaving him as the coach rolled to a stop. "Well, brace yourself. It looks as if my cousin has just arrived, rather sooner than we all expected, too." Will felt low, stark anticipation and fear blossom in his belly, and he looked anxiously back to find a lone rider heading towards them at a gentle trot, his erect carriage and tight control of his horse unconsciously indicative of great personal power and confidence. "Shall we?" Anthony urged, amused by his discomfort. Swallowing hard, Will emerged to a silent audience of Westvale servants turned out in their starched and pristine uniforms, watching him with curious eyes. He felt their interest like the tickle of fingers over his skin, uncomfortable and close. Their attention, however, was mitigated by the arrival of Will's husband, and, indeed, his own attention shifted to take in the man dismounting before the staff. He felt Anthony at his shoulder, a curious and amused presence watching the both of them. Hannibal Lecter was nothing like Will had imagined. He was older, far older than Will had thought he might be, which was the only impression he was able to garner before the travel-dusty and weary man's amber-bright eyes fastened on him and bloomed fire. Hannibal locked eyes with the slender, alarmed little Omega next to his cousin, pale but for the rosy tint to their still round cheeks, wide blue eyes framed in long curling lashes, head topped with a riot of glossy dark curls, and a sweet scent wafting his way that was a mouth-watering mixture of youth and fertility that momentarily struck Hannibal dumb. But only momentarily. "Hannibal!" Anthony said, grinning. "You are just in time for our arrival." The staff waited, uneasy and bewildered by the sudden tension even their dulled beta senses could feel, unwilling to insert themselves into an unseemly family matter. "I should say you are just in time, cousin," Hannibal said, his critical eyes traveling once again to the undeniably beautiful and delicate little creature now trembling at Anthony's side. The scent grew stronger when the breeze shifted, bringing him the sweet hot spice of an unmated omega that, once discovered, could never be ignored. Glowering, he sharply asked, "Why did you bring that thing here?" Will flinched, the bottom dropping out from his stomach. He clenched his hands in the folds of his skirt and trembled from repressing the urge to hide. "Why, for you, cousin," Anthony said, his grin positively wicked. "May I introduce your new wife?" The silence was stifling. It was broken soon enough by Hannibal coldly ordering, "Into the house. Now." It was chaos from there. The servants scattered in every direction, scrambling to get out of the path of their silently enraged, newly returned master. Hannibal grabbed Will by his elbow and bodily hauled him into the house, with Anthony, a laughing third, shouting over the sound of Will's distressed yelp, "Don't do any harm, Hannibal!" "Grandfather!" Hannibal bellowed, dragging the frightened Omega alongside him into the Duke's office, where the elderly Alpha was working, a ferocious frown on his own spare, lean face. Hannibal flung Will hard at the desk, and he fell against it, catching himself on his hands, briefly eye to eye with the Duke, before he was able to jerk back and fall into a deep curtsy. "Cease that nonsense this instant," Hannibal said, turning his fierce glare on his calm, unmoved grandfather. "Would you please explain to me how this has happened?" Will bit his lower lip, his trembling knees almost refusing to hold him up. It was too much all at once for a boy who had never been in any company other than his father's, and now found himself drowning in the presence of 3 Alphas at odds. The Duke's eyes flicked to Anthony, who moved to take Will's elbow and deposit him into the chair near his desk, where he sat stiff as a board, trying to adjust. "Hannibal," the Duke said, his vibrant voice as deep as his grandson's and filled with that same alpha power that turned Will's legs to jelly. "Welcome home." "Welcome home?" Hannibal echoed and laughed without humor. "Welcome home. Grandfather, please explain to me how your intention to procure a wife from a proper family resulted in Anthony bringing home this," he gestured at Will and settled for, "mixed abortion of genders." The Duke's gaze hardened on Hannibal, disapproval in every line of his face. He looked at Will, who shivered in the chair but did not shrink. He merely inwardly retreated from the lash of their anger and Hannibal's harsh words. Fear and hopelessness rolled off him in waves, agitating all 3 Alphas in the room even more so than the situation itself. Anthony hovered nervously around him, uncertain what to do, but driven to care for an Omega who was in such telling and gut-wrenching distress, even if not one whit of it showed on his impassive young face. "Hannibal, you are my heir, and a gentleman. Must I remind you to watch how you speak?" the Duke finally said, his cold stare enough to bring his grandson's sharp tongue under some form of control. Taking a deep breath, he rang the little bell behind him, and they waited in silence for the butler to arrive. When he did, the Duke said, "Mr. Hawkes, I believe Mr. Stamets is still on the premises. Fetch him here, if you please. Have cook send up tea and cakes." "Yes, by all means, let us compound this insanity with tea and cakes," Hannibal scoffed, pinching the bridge of his noble nose with weary exasperation. "Anthony," the Duke said, ignoring him, "I expect you have some explanation for this?" "I merely did as I was bidden, grandfather," Anthony smoothly replied, straightening his waistcoat with renewed satisfaction, his hand falling to Will's nape without him being aware of it. "I went to the Reddick household and married Willia Graham in Hannibal's stead, as instructed. I had not thought the fact that Willia was an Omega was of any consequence, as she had been vetted by Mr. Stamets." Will trembled under the touch, almost as frightened by the comfort it brought as he was by the tempers of the men around him. His gift, heightened by his fear, forced him to feel their anger acutely, to instantly understand why Lord Clarges was so angry, why the Duke was impatient, why Anthony was bristling and unpredictable. It was painful to have such clarity, and it left him mute in his chair, heedless of anything but the men around him. Did you not indeed? The Duke softly asked, his cold brown eyes on his other grandson. This is outrageous, Hannibal pointed out, looking from his grandfather to his cousin, his face tight with fury. You sent word that you had married the Earl's daughter, who I am told is a very fetching creature with dark hair and blue eyes, and is the sum of every feminine beauty one could desire. Anthony's cat-like grin returned when he said, I did, my dear cousin. I went there and married a very fetching creature with dark hair and blue eyes, who is the sum of every feminine beauty one could desire. Anthony, the Duke said, clear warning in his tone. Then perhaps you should take it, Hannibal suggested, pinning his cousin with his fierce brown gaze, ignoring the pained noise Will made. He did not care what discomfort the Omega was currently in, because it was not his concern to tend to, no matter how its distress dragged at his nerves. There had been an awful and costly mistake, and he was determined to set it to rights. He leveled a pointed stare at Anthony's soothing hand and snapped, It certainly seems to like you well enough. Sit! The Duke shouted, the lash of his alpha presence stinging even the stronger of his grandsons. This is my house, and I will be obeyed. They sat, Anthony pale-faced and shaken from his cruel humor, reluctantly removing his hand from Will's nape. Hannibal, stonily silent and tense, but doing as he was told, though his resentment was thick enough to taste. Give me the documents, the Duke ordered, and Anthony offered them from his small satchel, all of them silent while they were thoroughly examined. Will made himself as small as he could manage, eyes closed, and head tipped down in token submission, vibrating with tension that threatened to spill over into tears. He knew better than to expect mercy from any alpha, but he had hoped in some strange way that life here would be less fearful than facing his father's daily disgust with him. Now all he could wish for was to be home again, hard at work at some menial task given to him by Blake, ignored and largely undisturbed. William, the Duke said not unkindly. William, look at me when I speak to you. Will looked up, but his eyes stayed unfocused and distant, with the blank readiness for retribution that his life at home had trained him for. He had little hope, otherwise, with 3 alphas in the room, and all of them varying degrees of angry, the 2 strongest sense overpowering, deadening Will's senses to anything but his dread and his awful, unwanted gift. Yes, your Grace, he said, his voice so small and soft it was barely better than a whisper. I see that you signed these documents with your own legal name, the Duke said, ignoring Hannibal's chuff of disdain. William, is that how you choose to be called? Yes, your Grace, he admitted, having no other recourse. Will, if it pleases you. Was there some valid reason why your father chose not to send us your sister, Wilhelmina? Will swallowed, reluctant to repeat what had been said to him. He wet his lips and stared into the middle distance, offering, Mina is only just promised to Lord Rathmore. Father could find no reason to break their engagement and engender hard feelings when he had me to spare. He felt Hannibal's eyes on him, fair boring holes into him with their heat. Will nervously turned away, caught between the stark stares of the 3 alphas with no escape in sight. Except that he was in clear breach of contract, the bounder, Hannibal informed him, glowering at the Omega across from him, vastly annoyed that it lacked the good grace to leave of its own accord. Far from it, the Duke responded. The contract was that House Reddig would provide a spouse to my heir, who was of bearing age, to secure the line of succession. William is an Omega. They're notoriously prone to fertility, as well as producing alphas nearly consistently. There was no stipulation in the contract whatsoever the spouse be a beta female. The Duke fell silent again, looking at what was before him. Finally, he stacked the papers in his long, pale fingers and tidied them before drawing a deep breath. The tea and cakes had arrived and were set out by nervous staff, keyed to the tension in the room, which they quit as quickly as humanly possible. It is difficult for me to think, Anthony, that you did not intend harm to your cousin in this matter, the Duke said, settling back in his chair to turn his icy gaze on his younger grandson. Knowing what you know about Hannibal makes it almost impossible to believe otherwise. I did as you were told. Yes, you have already said so, Hannibal interrupted, fingers drumming a restless rhythm onto the wooden arm of the chair. The question is, how do we undo it? "There will be no undoing it," the Duke flatly announced, holding up his hand in a staying gesture before Hannibal could protest. "No, all the necessary paperwork has been submitted already, and the news will be printed in the papers come morning, as per my arrangements. No, there is no undoing it, Hannibal." "I refuse, then," Hannibal said, his anger transmuted to deadly calm. "I refuse to have it." Will shrank slightly into the chair, almost vanishing inside a froth of silk and lace, his stomach a churning lump of self-disgust and sickening fear. Only years of his father's belittling and beatings kept him from tears of hopelessness. That, and an unyielding streak of pride, which stiffened his spine like a steel rod, neither beating nor punishment ever quite able to peel it out of him completely. The Duke leaned forward and very carefully said, "If you refuse, Hannibal, then you will forfeit your place as my heir." Dead silence greeted that remark. Anthony's gaze shifted quickly from the Duke to Hannibal, thoughts moiling in his eyes. "My terms were very clear. Return at once to claim your bride, father a son, and secure your inheritance. If you defer the spouse I have chosen for you, you defer your place as my heir, which, I suppose, is precisely what young Anthony here hopes to have happen." "Grandfather!" Anthony protested, shutting his mouth with a snap when the Duke looked his way yet again. He subsided, showing his own meek side in the face of the Duke's disapproval. "Are you putting this thing's interest above the interests of your family, grandfather?" Hannibal coldly asked, his stare matching the elder Alpha's. It was clear where he got his temper from, as well as his formidable strength of will. "I am abiding by a contract, which you will accept if you wish to one day be the Duke in my stead. No one is forcing you to do anything you do not wish to, Hannibal. The papers are signed, everything is in order. If you reject William and choose to disgrace the Lecter name for the sake of your own pride, then I would venture to say that you are the one choosing other interests above those of this family. And if that is the case, then you cannot be entrusted with either my title or the responsibility for our family at large." Hannibal's mouth thinned into a tight line of displeasure. Mr. Stamets arrived then, ashen and sweating and hoping not to be noticed. He jumped when Mr. Hawkes announced him and immediately fell into a low bow, which the Duke ignored. "I have but one question for you, Mr. Stamets. Is this the child you met and recommended?" Mr. Stamets took one look at Will and vigorously nodded, saying in a rush, "Yes, your Grace, she most certainly is. I was taken immediately by her modesty and beauty, so becoming in a young lady her age, and her accomplishments, as I have already offered. You may continue to extol its virtues until the cows come home," Hannibal said, transferring that terrifying stare to him, and pointed at Will's slender, unmoving form with one imperious finger. "That, however, is not a woman. You gave me the wrong one, you imbecile." Mr. Stamets paled even more, on the verge of a swoon from fright. "Mr. Hawkes, take Mr. Stamets to the parlor. Get him a brandy, please," the Duke ordered. "Anthony, go home. Grandfather, Hannibal, go refresh yourself. You've had a long trip, and your temper is not all I could hope for," he said, utterly ignoring his other grandson, who skulked from the room without another word. "As for you, William—" "Yes, your Grace?" Will responded, some small measure of anxiety abating with one less Alpha in the room. "Please do me the pleasure of pouring for me." Yes, your Grace," Will responded, roused somewhat from his terrified stupor. Hannibal wrinkled his noble nose at him and sharply said, "No better than a boy in a dress. How little this family respects itself." With one last telling look at his grandfather, he quit the room in a simmering temper, leaving Will alone with the aging Alpha. "What is your preference in a dress?" the Duke asked, a polite opener for conversation with an unfamiliar Omega. "Male address is my preference," Will answered, thinking of how ridiculous that sounded when he was dressed in feminine clothing. "It is how my father raised me." The Duke nodded, adding that to his knowledge of Will. His calm affected a returning calm on Will's part, the shift in his scent from acrid anger to warm age like a fine old book, soothing the Omega's frayed emotions. "Mr. Graham, then," he said, careful not to use Will's married name as yet. "Did you take instruction with your sisters?" Will hesitated before nodding, admitting in a small but steady voice, "Yes,
I have the same instruction as any Omega of a noble family. It was my mother's dying wish that I should be educated as such."
"But it does not interest you," Duke prodded, frowning softly.
"I am not precisely disinterested," Will said, hesitating to answer with a half-truth. "I have merely been born into a household with 7 sisters before me, who were expected to wed and do their duty. It was never expected I would follow in their footsteps."
"But you possess the necessary understanding of households to run one from either direction," the Duke clarified, nodding softly when Will did. "Tell me, Will, do your true talents lie in paths your sisters were not allowed to pursue?"
Will hesitated only slightly before nodding again.
"Well, you are less inclined to be feminine than some Omegan children I have encountered, but not for lack of charm. You're certainly pleasing overall."
"I was once told that when it suits me, I am more than a competition for my sisters," Will stammered, flushing with embarrassment to relay the praise that had bolstered him through the entirety of his puberty, a kindness that he had hoarded. It simply does not suit me, Your Grace." Will straightened a little, hoping he didn't seem terribly shabby to the man who held his fate in both aristocratic hands.
"Goodness, you are a sight for sore eyes," he was told, and lifted his gaze in surprise. "Stand up, Mr. Graham, let me look at you."
"Yes, Your Grace," Will murmured, straightening at once for the aged Alpha before him. The scent of him was even stronger without the other sense to confuse it, triggering a primal response in Will's Omegan body. His eyes dilated, his heart rate jumped. His clothes suddenly felt 2 sizes too small, and the fine hairs all over his body lifted. Faced with an unknown Alpha, without others who might stymie him, his entire body seized on survival, ally or flight. And Omegas had always formed alliances through flesh. It was an unaccountable and unknown response that left him bewildered and rather frightened, all of which was immediately conveyed without his meaning to be.
"A sight for sore eyes indeed,"
the Duke said, a stately and handsome man who must have been very breathtaking indeed in his prime. Will thought now he had a chance to look at him without fear clawing at his insides. Even now, with his hair gone silver white with age and his skin lined with experience, he was intimidating and impressive.
"Bless your soul, Mr. Graham, your father did you no favours in keeping you from polite company. I can nearly taste you from here, my dear."
"I am mortified, Your Grace," Will whispered, blushing furiously, embarrassed. He dropped into another bow, more to hide his flaming cheeks than to offer respect.
Nonsense, nonsense, you've nothing to be ashamed of," the Duke said, shifting to wheel his chair out from behind his desk, his legs hidden behind a light blanket in his lap. "I'm flattered and terribly pleased. A response that strong means you'll breed well for my grandson."
Will swallowed, hesitant, unsure what he should do. His confused and raw instincts pushed him to make a submissive gesture, but it ran counter to everything his father had taught him. So he stood there in the center of the room, trembling with indecision and growing panic that something was terribly and irrevocably wrong with him.
"Come here, Mr. Graham," the Duke said, sensing his unease.
He brought his wheelchair close to the armchair nearest the tea-set and patted the cushion.
"Come, have a seat. You've gone quite pale. I don't wish to distress you. Your upbringing has been very unusual indeed."
Will did as he was told, unable to do anything other than obey an Alpha with such presence. When he sat, he took a soft breath to accustom himself to the Duke's scent, surprised when the Duke gathered his hand up and briskly rubbed his palm with his thumb. It was strangely soothing, as Anthony's touch had been, and Will relaxed, a shiver running out of him with the gentle motion. His father had but rarely touched him with kindness. Though heavy-handed with his correction, the Earl had been entirely spare with his distant affection, to the point that the touch went straight to Will's starved heart.
There, that's better,
the Duke said, smiling at him, so that his sharp teeth were bared behind his full beard.
My cousin on my mother's side was Omegan. He lived entirely as male, but he was such a nervous little creature. Always said nothing calmed him like a warm touch."
Will nodded, growing used to the scent of him, making the connection between the elderly Duke and the kindness being shown him.
"It's a pity you're so young, Mr. Graham,"
the Duke said, pleased when he relaxed. He didn't stop rubbing Will's palm, which seemed to be soothing to the both of them.
"My grandson has 12 years on you. A peculiar prickly beast, that boy, as you've unfortunately discovered for yourself." He gazed out of the window, quite lost in his thoughts, his movements stilling until he simply sat there. Will's hand wrapped in his. "Wondrous creatures, Omegas," he mused, giving Will a warm squeeze. "I'd quite forgotten how comforting it is to be near one. This family has done itself a grave disservice going without for so long." Will sensed that he was not expected to remain silently attentive, and softly ventured, "Shall I pour, your grace?" "Ah, yes, Will, please," the Duke said, releasing his hand with another soft squeeze. "Anthony certainly had an agenda bringing you as he did, but as I told my grandson, it's all perfectly legal and binding. I am certain that Hannibal will see reason once his temper has had a chance to settle. War has no good effect on anyone, and has done nothing to improve his disposition." Will took a steadying breath and poured for them, trembling only just a little now, but managing not to spill. He adjusted it to the Duke's preference, and waited for him to take a sip, only then pouring himself a cup. The soothing heat comforted him, and helped ease the knot that had formed in his belly. But he couldn't keep the image of Hannibal from his mind for long, the utter contempt and disgust on his face when he looked at Will. To distract himself, he finally asked, "Will it matter that I'm not as feminine as some Omegas are?" The Duke studied him, his dark amber eyes assessing. "No, Will. It may serve you well where my grandson is concerned. Perhaps the fewer reminders he has that you are an Omega, the better. He is a peculiar boy." Will swallowed hard, processing that. Carefully, he asked, "Would you still want me to remain? I have no grounds to dissuade you should send me home, considering I have deceived you." "Your father is the one who deceived us, Will. But would it surprise you if I did want you to remain? Perhaps for selfish reasons. Knowing my grandson as I do, I can say with some certainty that he will do his duty by you until you give us an heir, and then he will leave you to your own devices as he pursues his own." "That sounds rather similar to most marriages between great families." Yes, yes, it does. You will remain here with your children, naturally, and ease me through my dotage with your presence and the joy of little feet pattering through these halls again. It is perhaps not an ideal life, but there is a chance for happiness in it that might rival what your life could offer if you remain in your father's house." Will considered it, thoughtful. What remained for him in his father's house was not pleasant, if the past 18 years were anything to judge by. Without Mina there to stand as an inconstant shield between them, Will wasn't entirely sure he would last another year in his father's questionable care. "I've never given much thought to children, but I suppose I should like to have one or two," he said, surprising himself with the truth. "I would have a place here, and your protection." "Mine, and my grandson's to follow," the Duke said, reaching out to pat him again, a compulsive act of calming when confronted by Will's doubts. "When I do eventually die, he will know where his place is and take it accordingly. He will treat you with the respect and consideration you are due." Will absorbed that in silence. The Duke smiled kindly at him and said, "Finish your tea, Will, and then I'll have Mr. Hawkes see you to your room. I am sure you need to rest up some and prepare yourself for supper, as we shall all be in attendance." "Yes, your grace," Will said, managing a hesitant, uncertain smile. "I should like that very much."